Good morning. As you can see by the title slide here, the idea behind this presentation is it's a hodgepodge of things. We're going to talk about the due dates one more time because I'm paranoid about making sure everybody gets the information. We are going to work on using the data to prove a point. We're going to talk briefly about internal citations. Using the data to prove a point will kind of be a setup for let's write a good paragraph that we'll be coming across in the next couple of days. We're going to set up the critical writing, critical thinking part by talking about analysis. And in this case, the analysis is what type of detective novel or what type of novel is The Life We Bury. And so we're just going to run through all of these things. I hope that I can keep things kind of on track, and we'll go from there. Again, the due dates, the topics selected by today, please put it in the Google Drive folder. The thesis, once again, just create a document called preliminary thesis. Write your preliminary thesis in that Google Drive folder by Wednesday. The first entry in the annotated bib, especially for those of you who will be in that first writing group, have your first entry in the annotated bib so we can talk about the good, the bad, the great, and the ugly of all of the things that you've been writing. The annotated bib itself, with 3 of the sources that you're going to be using in the paper, will be due the 8th, and your final research paper will be due the 17th. Reading assignments, by today you should be to page 67. By Wednesday, page 99. By Friday, the page 129, and by the 1st, page 163. Internal citations. For internal citations, I am going to take 2 passages from the novel. And both of them come from page 137. And I'm going to talk about A, how to cite them depending on how you use the quotation and how much of the quotation you're using. And B, the idea that I've been stressing already, and I want to keep stressing, that data, when it comes from a source of your research that you're doing, does not speak for itself. You must use data to prove a point. All right, so I have this quotation. We are going to pretend that this is nonfiction, that this is data that we're going to use in the research paper. So, the blue highlight here. The novel shows that tragedy is usually unexpected. That's my sentence. That's the point I am trying to make. I am now going to take a complete sentence from the paragraph. Light clouds covered the horizon in advance of the sunrise, the stillness of the surrounding valley belying the ugliness of coming events. That quotation is designed to prove the point that the novel shows that tragedy is usually unexpected. I should, in a full paragraph, and I will talk about this Wednesday or Friday, have 2 or 3 more sentences behind this to explain how the quotation ties to the point. All right. You can view it in a debate term of claim data warrant. You can use it in the term of, making the statement, providing the context, and explain. However the terminology is that you want to use it, paragraphs should build upon each other. To go back to the citation, notice that it's word for word quoted, so you have quotation marks around it. Notice that the period goes at the end. Notice its author's last name, page number. All right. And then here's a second quotation from page 137, and we're going to use that next to, again, talk about how one can use a quotation. We won't be using the full sentence this time. We'll just be using bits and pieces and blending it together with your own analysis. Talbot asserts that war changes people. Carl went to Vietnam as a person whose life did not have room for the, quote, notion of killing or being killed, unquote, but the war, quote, weighed Carl down, unquote, and made him feel old. All right? Notice that because I have Talbot's name at the start of the sentence there, I don't have to put the quotation or his name in the parentheses. Notice also that I didn't use the whole sentence. I took bits and pieces and I just blended them in with my own prose. That is perfectly acceptable. And I think a lot of times it might even be preferable to trying to just slap a sentence or slap a paragraph or, whatever right behind the statement. The point I want to emphasize here again is if you have the author identified in the sentence, you don't need it in the parentheses. If you do not have the author identified in the sentence, you need his name in the parentheses. That's one. Number two, please remember that the data does not stand by itself. The quotations you lift, the paraphrases you lift, do not stand by themselves. They have to illustrate a point. And third, although it's not explained here, and I'll try to be explaining that, like I said, on Wednesday or Friday, remember that you've made the statement, Talbot asserts that war changes people. You have the data to back it up. You have to explain how that data, how those quotations help illustrate the point. I've said to students in classes when I was a debate coach, I said it to my debaters. Don't make your audience think. Don't let your audience think. Take them by the hand, lead them to the point you want them to make, or you want them to get. Lead them to the point you are making. Remember that longer quotations have a different format. You set off the quotations in a block, you omit the quotation marks, you begin on a new line, you indent a half inch, you double space the quotation, citation comes after the closing punctuation mark, and you maintain the double spacing throughout the essay. And so, war destroys one's will to live. That's my line. I now have a huge quotation behind that. And again, I would have to explain it as I go. I didn't double space here because it wouldn't quite fit on the slide. Remember that you have to have double spacing all the way through. Okay, if there's any questions about the citations and the use of citations, please talk to me. Remember, at the start of every class period, there's a one question, one comment. That should give you plenty of time to ask questions, and hopefully I'll be able to clarify. I want to move on to the book now. This is the third class period. I've asked you guys to buy the book. Please double check the email that I sent out yesterday, and about the books you're supposed to buy. Remember that you don't have to buy the Glass Castle. I'm not sure how the bookstore put Dr. Sullivan's orders together with mine, but remember you don't have to buy the Glass Castle. The Who's Edgar comes from the back of the book, The Life We Bury, and you'll notice that it was the winner of a Left Coast Crime Rosebud Award. It was the winner of the Barry Award. It was a 2015 Edgar Award finalist. It was a Minnesota Book Award finalist. It was a finalist for a lot of other things. And so I want to talk about who's Edgar and why should we care. Edgar is named for Edgar Allan Poe, and Poe was the first American detective stories. He wrote Murders in the Rue Morgue and The Purloined Letter. He created this detective named C. Auguste Dupin, who predates Sherlock Holmes by decades. And because it's an Edgar, we know that it is somehow a detective novel. However, a detective novel has 3 or 4 different subgenres that it can fall into. And I think part of analysis, part of critical thinking is, where does this fit on the spectrum of detective novels? And so we'll start with the traditional detective formula, and we'll talk about the plot. The purpose of the story is to have the reader solve the puzzle. The traditional detective, is all about a puzzle. There was a crime. Yes, that crime is usually a murder, but we're not going to focus on the violence. We're not going to focus on the bloodshed or the gore. We're going to focus on the puzzle. Who did it? How did they do it? How can we prove it? The detective is trying to solve the puzzle. The reader goes along for the ride to try to solve the puzzle. The crime is seemingly perfect. The clues are usually presented very, very early in the story. There might be some red herrings. There might be some things thrown in to toss you off the reader off the track. But the traditional detective formula basically has everything presented to solve the puzzle very, very early. Many of the clues, as I said, are misleading, but all the clues you need to solve the puzzle are there. The detective in a traditional detective story is an amateur who has superior mind and powers of observation. Dupin, Edgar Allan Poe's detective, was smarter than everybody else in the room. Sherlock Holmes was smarter than everybody else in the room. They weren't trained police detectives. They were amateurs, but they were smarter than everybody else in the room. They had observations. They saw things that nobody else saw. A lot of times, the detective has some unusual features or habits. Dupin lived in the dark. He boarded up his room, and so that everything was black as night all the time. Sherlock Holmes was very, very tall, skinny, with that big hook nose. Hercule Poirot is a short man with a large egg-shaped head that seems too big for his body. That's the traditional detective story, all right? And that's the detective. The storyteller, the person telling the story in the traditional detective tale, usually is not the detective himself. And we'll talk about why that's important when we get to the hard-boiled detective story. The narrator usually is a bold admirer of the detective. Watson loves Sherlock Holmes. All right. The unnamed narrators in Agatha Christie's stories of Hercule Poirot are huge fans of Hercule Poirot. Dupin is the narrator in those stories, loves him. And many times the narrator is the detective's sidekick. And the author or narrator is never going to lie to you. The author or narrator will never tell a lie. The author or narrator may lead you down the wrong path, but it's because they themselves are confused. Other settings and plot details. Many times these are rural stories or small town stories. For example, the TV series Murder, She Wrote, which was based on a series of books, takes place in Cabot Cove, Maine. How anybody was left alive in Cabot Cove, Maine after all of those deaths is beyond me. But, that's part of it. It's a rural setting, small town setting. The victim is usually somebody everybody hates. Usually they're the rich folk, especially in the British thing. There's Lord somebody or Lady somebody. There's somebody with a lot of money who are involved. And there's usually cops who are inept. There's often false arrests. There's often false leads. There's often lots of bad stuff happening. And usually at the end, the detective gathers everybody together to explain how he solved the crime. And most of the time it's a he. However, some of the cozies have a female lead, so how he or she solved the crime. The hard-boiled detective formula is the opposite of the traditional detective formula. It's focusing on character development, not the puzzle. Who's the detective? What's he like? How did he get to be this way? How are the people he is interacting with? What are they like? How did they get to be this way? Many times it's a psychological study as much as it's a focus on the crime. One of the most famous hard-boiled detective novels of all time is called The Big Sleep. And in The Big Sleep, the chauffeur is murdered, We never figure out who's murdered. He never gets mentioned again. That would never happen in a traditional story. The emotions are low level and very flat. Um, Everybody seems to be on a very, very low key. A lot of times the characters are all beaten up by the world. It's as if they have survived COVID for 5 years. Most of the people, most of the institutions are corrupt. Perhaps there's corruption in the police department or in the mayor's office or in city hall, or the businessman is corrupt. We don't have the situation where the upper class people are usually good people except for the one who was murdered. And there's usually no clear good guys. A lot of times there's lots of shades of gray in a hard-boiled detective, whereas in the traditional novel there are clear good guys and clear bad guys. And it's usually in an urban setting. It's much easier to corrupt the urban setting and make it dark and dreary than it is the rural setting. The detective in a hard-boiled detective novel is also different from the detective in the traditional detective novel. He can be a professional or an amateur. He can be a former police officer, a former Army MP. He can have some training. Sometimes he's a private detective, or usually he's a private detective, but sometimes he might have been a former cop, as I said. The detective is often amoral, not immoral, but amoral. He's going to have his own set of rules. It's the next thing you see here. He has a personal code. He's going to follow this personal code to the letter. All right. And if that puts him outside the law a little bit, if that puts him outside of the rules that society says he's supposed to follow a little bit, then so be it. And the detective is often a smart donkey in the biblical sense. He's someone whose mouth is going to be as sharp as possible. He's also going to be able to be violent. He's going to hit people. He's going to not be adverse to pulling a gun if he carries a gun. This is not the little old lady, Miss Marple from Cabot Cove. This is a different sort of detective. The third kind of detective novel is the police procedural. And in the police procedural, the plot gives you the depictions of official investigations. And as they go through these official investigations, there's going to depict the work of the police officers who will probably be solving multiple crimes simultaneously. All right, for example, if you look at the picture, there's the badge for Sergeant Joe Friday. This was the TV show Dragnet that began as a radio program in the 1940s or 50s, was on TV in the 60s and 70s. There was a movie starring Tom Hanks, late 80s, early 90s, I believe, and it's Joe Friday. Starred Tom Hanks and Dan Aykroyd. But Sergeant Joe Friday, the TV show or movie, was called Dragnet. And they will deal with 2 or 3 crimes. Sometimes those crimes might overlap, but a lot of times they're dealing with it simultaneously. But it's the cops. It's not an amateur detective. It's not a private detective. It's the cops doing all of the work. They will oftentimes deal with police-related topics, forensics, autopsies, getting search warrants. All right. They will try to do things by the book much more often than the hard-boiled detective, and they will have a book to follow because they're professionals, as opposed to the amateur who is going to have to go to the cops to get help later on. The characters, protagonist is usually a police officer. It's going to talk about the drudgery, the long hours, the administrators hassling them, spending all of their time filling out paperwork, excuse me. All of those things are going to be part of the police procedural itself. Okay. And despite the hard work, the case may be solved by luck. The luck versus work, the fate versus free will seems to play into all of these, but especially here in the police procedural. as we go through this novel, what we're going to be doing is looking at which genre, subgenre does this book fit in, and where are elements from the other subgenres? Because it seems to me that Eskins seems to be trying to create a salad here, where he's mixing genres to create his character and his novel and the plot. And finally, there's irony and sick humor. Sorry for jumping ahead there and not clicking on the slide. The daily writing. As I was looking through, a lot of you claim that you've only read one or two books in the last year. And so I want you to take a couple of minutes. Those of you who are going to be watching this down on the video, just make your answer in the comments. If you're in class, you're going to create a document and respond in the daily writing folder. But if you're watching the video, just respond in the comments. Why didn't you read more in 2020? Okay. For example, I'll be perfectly honest. One of the reasons I didn't read more, I had a good start. But once COVID hit, my favorite kinds of reading just seemed to have more drama than I wanted to deal with. There was enough drama in the real world. I didn't need more drama in my reading world. And it seemed like my reading fell off quite a bit. I finally was able to pick up with nonfiction after, when the first semester ended, and I was able to get 3 or 4 books read during break. But I had a really slow year because I just didn't want to deal with the drama. If you've got different reasons for not reading, if you don't like reading or something else, if college is taking up too much time, whatever, just give me a couple of sentences in the comments about why most of you were 1 or 2 books. Why don't you read more? Okay. Moving on. Oops, I guess that's it. So I hope all of you have a good day. Remember the due dates, and we will talk to you in class on Wednesday. Remember to have a question, or a comment ready to go, so we can cover all the bases we need to.